Welcome to the Something About Science podcast. My name is Megan from AzoNano, and I'm joined by
Skylar from Azom
and Danielle from News Medical.
We'll be bringing you a roundup of the latest research that is piquing our interest on our sector-specific sites. Try saying that one over and over again. In today's episode, we'll be covering questions that ask:
how did gout, the disease of kings, become a 21st century epidemic?
What can satellite technologies tell us about the state of global forest degradation?
And can we finally find evidence of life beyond our solar system?
Well, we're going to talk about love. Whether it be familial or something more than friends, love is something that we all experience. And while some loves can seem irrational and inexplicable, there are underlying biological mechanisms behind them. And oxytocin is a neuropeptide that is involved in social bonding and pleasure. And researchers from Michigan State University have been investigating the role of this hormone in heart regeneration. In an interview conducted by my colleague Amy, known to you listeners as producer Amy, and featured on News Medical, it was explained how researchers found that oxytocin boosted the ability of epicardial cells to turn into stem cells and proliferate. Investigating the effects further, the team looked at zebrafish, a model organism that's known for its regenerative abilities. It was found that removing oxytocin limited the regenerative capabilities of zebrafish. The researchers then went on to explain how the medical implications of such findings could include the treatment of those who have undergone a myocardial infarction. So that's my little summary of this interesting piece of research about how oxytocin can lead to possible regenerative abilities of the heart.
They're quite difficult, aren't they, to generate from stem cells? It's like one of the groups that are one of the most difficult ones to regenerate, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but is it the ones that they're only generated right when you're born? I think? There'll be something. Science comes in. Yeah. But I know it's one of the different ones. That's cool though.
That's why it's significant, is that it's a cell type that is difficult to sort of regenerate or sort of induce stem cell capabilities of. So yeah, it was interesting. It's interesting that I think the idea of like a hormone that you get from social bonding and the importance of that social bonding on health, like you think that obviously having a close social circle is good for your mental health, but actually obviously the release of this hormone is actually good for your physical health in ways that you wouldn't expect.
How much of your feeling of love comes from this hormone?
I'm not sure. I know that oxytocin is released and is one of the main things in terms of love, in terms of like a mother and child. Like it's oxytocin that's released when contractions start in labour, I believe.
Really? I didn't know that. I didn't know it was that early.
It definitely has a role in birth.
I think it's one of the key hormones that's, like Danielle was saying, is associated with these kind of key social behaviours and like companionship behaviours that we have. And it's like they always say that we're social creatures. And I think a lot of the time we think it's more psychologically, when in fact it is biological as well.
And you've got to realise and extrapolate to nature. If other animals pair bond for life, then there's going to be an underlying biological mechanism that's shared throughout all those different species, like penguins bond for life, and a few other bird species are known for it as well.
I'm going to go in a completely different direction, I think, and I'm going to talk about bacteria and bioplastic that is ocean-degradable. So this is actually based on an interview published on Azom, and it follows on from an interview I did quite a while ago with Dr. Anne Meyer from the University of Rochester, in which she described her work that led to the manufacturing of biofilms using 3D printing. So her lab has created the first kind of 3D printer for printing live bacterial cells, which is very cool. But in this interview, I talked to Anne again, as well as Dr. Alison Santoro from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And they're working in a group alongside other parties as part of, I think it's pronounced Nyrede Biomaterials, which is creating a biopolymer that can be broken down by bioplastic degrading microbes in marine environments. I think the problem of marine plastic pollution is pretty well known, but I don't know if it's as well known that most of our so-called biodegradable plastics don't actually biodegrade in marine environments. Usually these plastics are kind of tested for degradation in facilities that don't have a lot of oxygen, or they're processed at really high temperatures. But in oceans where it's cold and there's a lot of oxygen, they don't tend to break down as well. So this company called Mango Materials, or this group called Mango Materials, is making a PHB biopolymer that is made by bacteria as an energy storage molecule. And the bioplastic doesn't so much as degrade in seawater, so much as it's decomposed by the microbes. The group will also be using a 3D bioprinter developed by Anne to print living materials that have bioplastic degrading microbes in them to accelerate the breakdown of bioplastics in the ocean. And it's really cool, there's this picture included in the interview of some living stickers that basically 3D printed bacteria in the shape of, they've printed them into letters, and they're degrading the bioplastic that they're placed on beneath them. And you can peel them off and place them onto bioplastic elsewhere, and they'll degrade that bioplastic and start breaking it down. So the research has just entered its phase 2, which will see them create different bioplastic degrading living materials that can be tested in expendable ocean instruments, so things that won't be coming back to land, but we don't have to worry about them just becoming extra materials in the ocean. And the PHP bioplastic that's been made is being turned into 3D printable filaments so that it can be printed into shapes that then it allows the plastic degrading bacteria to be also 3D printed within the plastic structures. So obviously, like, plastic pollution is something that seems like this massive, insurmountable problem. But I think these kinds of solutions that are really nature-driven and also so scalable give me a lot of hope for the future when it comes to these kinds of issues. And also, we know that I love a 3D printing story.
You do.
I'm going to try and bring one into like every single episode.
Maybe we need a 3D printing klaxon. That was really interesting. Interesting as well that I've noticed on ASO Clean Tech and ASO Life Sciences, a study was recently covered that was about food packaging that was made from seaweed. So I think there's definitely like a concerted effort across different industries to sort of deal with this pollution problem, water pollution, ocean pollution, definitely.
Yeah, seaweed and alginate is usually used in seaweed studies, but also I think it's pronounced mycelium, like the mushroom.
Mycelium,
All these kind of nature-driven or like bio-inspired materials seem to me to be the best path forward when we're looking at kind of tackling our waste problem, because if you're using all these kind of new man-made chemicals, even if they can biodegrade, you have to then do something with those. Whereas if they're natural based, you're kind of taking from the environment, returning to the environment, and kind of reducing your cycle of harm, which sounds really obvious to say. But I think the problem with these technologies is that often less frequently scaled up and less frequently invested in. So it'll be interesting to see if these kind of things, because this group seems to have a decent amount of backing and a decent amount of interest, it'll be really cool to see what happens after phase 2 and see if they can scale up even further.
No, definitely. And I think one area of research that I always find quite interesting is utilising bacteria and kind of like small microbes to degrade plastic. And I think it's fascinating that they can consume plastic, because to us, when we look at plastic, and it's this kind of very like hard and very like sterile and not very appetizing material. And even for those of us, I think in biology, who are more familiar with the different diets and things of different species, and even from an evolutionary perspective, I think it's quite interesting perhaps look into the future, and if this is what there are bacteria or organisms that are kind of consuming this new industrial material, what might that mean for the future, and how might that affect current ecosystems and current food chains? That's just something I think quite interesting as well.
That is interesting. I hadn't even thought about that in terms of food chains, like where those bacteria go afterwards and stuff.
Yeah, I think another thing is also, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but there's an Instagram account called, I can't remember the name of it, but basically she has her own kind of optical microscope, and she'll go and take samples from like ponds and things like that and basically look at them. And I enjoy it because, science communication. And basically we'll have these really, really cool, really high definition videos and photos of all the different organisms that are in these just very small, like local water samples. And I've been following her for a while, and she's posted a new video recently. And it's a little bit sad, but she basically pointed out the presence of microplastics. And it was something that, this was a very kind of local pond with like not close to any, I suppose, kind of industrial pollution or anything like that. Yet already it is kind of being consumed by the rise in microplastics. And I think anything that can kind of help address this, or even help, I suppose, prevent it, is quite an important thing. And it's like Skylar was saying, it's great to hear that it has had a lot of funding, and it's great to hear that, in the future, hopefully it will be taken up by industry, and there will be other things like it as well.
Yeah, one of the statistics that was given in the interview as well was that at the current rate, there'll be more plastic than fish by weight in the ocean by 2050. And 2050 is not that far away if we think about it. So as well as thinking about the plastic we're putting into the ocean, we also need some ways of tackling the plastic that's already in there. So these kind of technologies are good as well, because they're not just thinking about how to limit the problem, it's how to solve the problems that we've already created, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I think the sticker element of that is like an ease of use thing. It seems, fairly easy for people to get their head around, easy to use, easy to implement. And like you said, the bacteria can be embedded in the actual plastic, but then it can be stuck on via the sticker to pre-existing materials that exist in the ocean already.
Yeah, it looks really cool. I'll show you afterwards. And I encourage our listeners to go and check out the interview, which we'll put in the show notes as well.
Definitely. Well, to kind of carry on along the same line of topics, I'm going to be speaking about an article that we've recently published on our AZO Clean Tech website, which talks about all things climate change, ecosystems, clean technology and renewable energy. And I'm just going to read the title first, just to get your imaginations going. But it's titled Weighing Earth's Forests Using a Space Umbrella.
Ooh.
So,
Thanks, Danielle.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of background about this first. So following the first Landsat launch by NASA in 1972, space technologies designed to study our planet have become one of the most influential implements in understanding how our planet is changing and responding to anthropogenic, which you can think of this as human-related activities. In 2023, the European Space Agency will launch Biomass, which is a mission that aims to provide a space-based survey of the Earth's forests, allowing scientists to monitor forest biomass and quantify the impacts of deforestation and climate change. Now, COP26 saw 145 countries endorse a pledge focused on halting and reversing forest loss and degradation by 2030. After all, forests help to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide levels by absorbing it via photosynthesis and storing it in plant biomass. So just to help you picture this, I did a little bit of background research here. So researchers estimate that in 1 year, a mature tree will absorb 48 pounds, that's around 21 kilograms for our metric users out there, of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is loads. And you think of, that's just one tree. And imagine an entire forest. I'm not going to even try and quantify that. But it's great that this pledge has been made, but despite it being put in place, only with accurate data can we actually understand how forest degradation is impacting our climate and help to design strategies that can help protect global forests. Now, Biomass, which is the mission that will go up in 2023, how is it going to actually work? Well, this Space Umbrella satellite, and yes, I can promise you that this is the technical term, utilises a new measurement technique to penetrate the forest layer and map hidden roots and branches. So the whole point of this technique being used was to basically give a more detailed, I suppose, view of forests, and kind of a lot of the technology out there will only do surface layer, and will only do, say, like the upper canopy. Whereas this new measurement technique, which is called a complete polymeric P-band radar system, can help to generate a 3D map of global forests, including, like I said, the root and the branches. So as well as this, we have a powerful reflector antenna on the satellite, which has already been fabricated. And with a targeted launch in 2023, the mission is in its last stages of development. And once it's in orbit, and I particularly like this part, the mission's data will be made public to everyone, which can give like a consistent, unbiased assessment of the Earth's biomass.
That's so cool.
That's really cool.
I love the name of it as well.
I know, I saw Space Umbrella and I was like, I need to see what this is. And in the article, there is a handy dandy video for you to learn more about it. So I highly encourage you to check it out.
So is the aim of the mission basically to completely quantify how much forest cover we have now and then see how it changes over time?
So I'm not sure if that's the core goal, is to completely quantify it. I'd kind of need to do some more fact checking. But I think the whole point of it is basically that we have a lot of satellites out there that obviously can kind of give more insight into the Earth and help to study the Earth. Like I mentioned Landsat. So Landsat is the longest running, I suppose, satellite series you could call it, to kind of study the Earth. So with this one in particular, it's basically helping to give more detailed information relevant to deforestation and what are the impacts of deforestation and forest degradation, and how is this affecting our kind of global climate. So knowing, I suppose, the changes to global forests and where the changes are, it can kind of help inform strategies and other reviews into kind of how do we address global deforestation and how do we create strategies to help mitigate it, and how do we what can those strategies do to help address increased atmospheric CO2 levels?
Brilliant.
I think the fact that the data will be available to the public might encourage people to look for themselves and potentially spend more time in their like forest areas, and maybe obviously with all the appropriate clearance, maybe plant some trees themselves in their local area, which would be good.
No, definitely. And I think one other aspect of the fact that it will be made publicly available, which I really liked the term unbiased, is that it can give a very clear and a very kind of just fact-based, evidence-driven, I suppose, illustration of global forests, which I feel like when you're developing strategies, because it's open access and because you can access it, there are a lot of, I suppose, infrastructures and organizational infrastructures, whether it's grassroots or whether it's, all the way up to kind of the UN. There are no limits on being able to access this information, and there are no limits on using that and creating strategies and creating even kind of like proposals to help address it.
This is one of my favourite topics. It's human genome evolution.
Woo!
Woo! Thank you. I wanted to share this finding that was featured as a news piece on AZO Life Sciences. So you may remember, if you cast your minds back to biology class, that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. Hands up how many people remembered that sentence, so they got a mark at GCSE or equivalent examinations. What you may not know is that they contain their own genetic information that is actually distinct from the DNA that you find in the nucleus of the cell, and that genetic information is actually carried down from the maternal line, meaning that you inherit that information from your mother. So in a paper published in Nature, researchers from the University of Cambridge have actually found that the mitochondrial DNA inserts itself into the nuclear DNA in 1 out of every 4,000 births. By first examining the DNA of over 11,000 families and then furthering that to 66,000 individuals, the researchers have highlighted a new model of genome evolution. Now, the reason why this is significant is because it was previously thought that these insertions had happened and ceased to happen a long time ago, long before humans had even evolved, and even further into the past when organisms didn't have mitochondria. For those who aren't aware, it is hypothesized that mitochondria came to be when a archaea engulfed a cyanobacteria. So these findings show that the insertion of mitochondrial DNA into the nuclear genome is something that continues to occur today. And I'm really excited to look out for more research in the future that can shed light on the implications of these insertions, the impact they have on human health, and just this phenomena in evolution in general.
Oh, I love it. Every time that Danielle comes in with something relating to human genetics or human evolution, it's great, gotta say. I also think it's fascinating that I think a lot of people think that mutations or even these small genetic changes don't happen in what we consider ourselves as modern organisms. Yeah, they continuously happen and are continuously happening. And, a lot of the time we don't really know why, when, or what the consequences are of them. And I think especially with something like you said, where it's mitochondrial DNA, it's this only very specific thing that we thought kind of just did its own thing and didn't really affect anything else, the fact that that's not true. Mm-hmm. It will be quite interesting to see what the consequences of that are. And for those of us who are not sure, again, on what mitochondrial DNA is, when you do a 23andMe test, Danielle, fact check me here.
No, true.
They go off your mitochondrial DNA, isn't it? To be able to get your
ancestry.
Because
the fact that it's inherited in the maternal line, you can track your maternal line back to the geographical area in which it came from.
So what about your paternal line? Did they have to do something different, or is it just a maternal line that they trace through 23andMe?
I'm not sure. I've only ever seen the maternal line traced.
Interesting.
I think because it's a complete part of the genome that is inherited rather than half and half, and then that's random. It's much easier to track the maternal line because you don't have to, when you've got mitochondrial DNA, you don't have to think, oh, is this maternal or paternally inherited? You just know it's a given. Whereas any specific sort of allele, one of them is going to be maternally inherited and one of them is going to be paternally inherited. But then the fact that you're only providing your DNA, if you wanted to decipher maternal or paternal, your parents would also have to contribute a DNA sample, I presume.
Yeah, I think
I'm not sure.
I think as well because everyone inherits it in the sense that whether you're a girl or a boy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you think about it that way, whereas like if you're a girl, you can't look at the paternal. Like Danielle was saying, it's complete. Whereas with maternal, it will be the same. So I believe, is it your maternal haplotype? I feel like haplotype is the
and that's the
correct
thing
term.
that's tracked back over time and over geographical location. There's a certain set of maternal haplotypes that you can belong to.
Yeah, so, and some of them are very, very, very old. So if you're any of the lucky few that have some that can be traced back to even kind of, I feel like some of them are perhaps even as old as like when modern humans came out of Africa. I feel like this needs to be fact checked, but like, it is pretty cool. It's how you basically track where you are.
That is cool. That is really cool.
It is cool. And it's cool that I think everyone just thinks that you've got DNA in your cell and it's just one recipe for proteins, you know, the usual spiel. But actually, you know, in every cell you have this organelle that runs its own show practically. Evidently, there's communication between the nucleus and the mitochondria, and more so than we previously imagined by these findings. So there is crosstalk, but you know, they've got distinct genomes and it's really cool.
I like the idea that it's matrilineal. One more argument for a matriarchy. This one was actually one of my favourite interviews I've ever done. It was really great. It was with Sascha Quanz, who's from ETH Zurich, and he's an exoplanetary scientist who'll be co-leading the new Centre for Origin and Prevalence of Life, which was launched very recently. The centre's going to be looking at how and why life arose on Earth, but also looking for evidence of life beyond our solar system. So, for a bit of background context, extrasolar planets or exoplanets are planets that orbit stars other than our sun. And Sascha's team are going to be using indirect methods to look for signatures of life in the atmospheres of these planets. And these kinds of bioindicators are molecules that we know are produced by biological activity, or predominantly by biological activity, such as methane, oxygen, nitrous oxide, and a couple others. And what I thought was really cool is that we know that for about half of the time we've had life on Earth, we've been able to detect this through atmospheric signatures going back. So this gives us a massive window of time to look at other extrasolar planets and kind of hope for similar signatures. So they're not necessarily looking for life that exists now, but any evidence that it existed in perhaps the last approximately 2 billion years, which is pretty cool because it opens up this massive opportunity for these kind of signatures. And to look for them, they're going to be building new equipment, such as the Extremely Large Telescope, which is its actual name, the ELT, which will be a European-led project, and it will have a 39-metre primary mirror, which is 5 times bigger than any current ground-based telescope. It is extremely large. But perhaps the coolest thing is that the whole point of the centre is to collaborate between disciplines. There'll be groups of chemists, biologists, earth and planetary scientists, astrophysicists, and the research will feed together to answer these questions, both about how life arose here on Earth and beyond it. And my favourite part of the interview was when I asked at the end if Sascha believed we would find life on other planets, and he said he was optimistic due to the sheer number of terrestrial planets out there and also this massive time window, but also because life is so robust. But he also said that he won't be disappointed if we don't find any signs of life after all of this, because it proves just how special Earth is. And I really like that. And it's kind of insane to think that we could be the only place in our solar neighbourhood where life emerged and has survived for billions of years. And that in itself would be a profound discovery, and that would be kind of mind-blowing in itself. And the whole time I was interviewing him up until this point, I was thinking, oh, it would be so disappointing if we're going through all of this effort, we don't even find anything. But the way he spun it was like, not finding something is a significant finding in itself. That really, I thought that was amazing. And anyway, it was a very long and very detailed interview in a brilliant way. And I haven't touched on half of the interesting content that he included, and he puts it much better than I can. So I would really, really recommend going to AzoQuantum and checking out that interview, because yeah, there's all sorts of stuff. He talks about the James Webb Telescope and also about space missions that will be included in this, and a bit more about that kind of collaboration between different disciplines as well. But yeah, it was a great interview. I loved hearing about it.
I think a lot of it is actually really in the title, Origin and Prevalence of Life. And it has to do with the fact that I think we have a long list of attributes or descriptive items that, you know, where we think what life does and how it behaves on Earth. But what life actually is, we have no clue about. We don't know when it arose and where it arose and how it arose. How do you go from chemical, non-living matter to biochemical living matter? And at what point do you decide, no, it's living, no, it's not living? All these things are completely unanswered. It's really in the title. And I think one of the realizations in many, many disciplines that are working on this topic was that in order to really make progress, you have to talk to other disciplines because there will be limits.
That was really interesting, and I really like the multidisciplinary approach. I think what you were saying at the end, the answer to the last question being a really nice thing to reflect on. One of the things that I like to reflect on with this specific example is the fact that life could have emerged so many times, and as exemplified by what we know about Earth's history, is that actually life can be created, but it can sort of lead to its own demise as well, which is what nearly happened with Earth. So I like to think that there's a possibility that life could have arose on many planets, but ultimately sort of hasn't survived as long as it has on Earth, or there hasn't been that overlap with life on Earth.
Definitely. And I think as well, what always kind of blows my mind is that even if there is something out there, and by the time that we get the signature from it, the time gap between, say, what's happening on that planet or that solar system or that galaxy and what's happening in ours is just so vast and so different that you have no idea what the current state of, potential life is out there. And it's like you say, it's great if we see something, it's great if we don't. There's just so many things we don't know, and anything that we can get to help fill in, I suppose, the gaps of our understanding of how we got here and how life on here got here and potentially may have existed elsewhere as well. It's all a bonus, really.
Yeah, it all goes hand in hand. And he did also say that, as an example, just looking at our nearest star, Proxima Centauri, I think it's how it's said, I'm sorry if it's wrong, but it has a small planet at roughly the right separation from the star to be at a temperature where, in principle, liquid water could exist. And that's just our nearest star. So just to kind of put it in perspective, when you zoom out and you really look at how many terrestrial planets could host life, I mean, it is pretty exciting that the fact that we could, within our lifetimes, find evidence of life outside of our solar system.
No, definitely. And just to kind of give a bit of background to our listeners who might not know, so one of the reasons that we look for water or presence of kind of liquid water on different planets is because that's where we hypothesized that the first organisms were kind of, I suppose, arose. So another kind of, I suppose, planetary object, let's call it, that has been under a lot of investigation is, I believe it's one of Jupiter's moons that has a layer of frozen water and then liquid water underneath. Yeah. So evidence of life, or the places that we look for life, might actually, there may be more places than we think. And I think any kind of organization that especially takes a multidisciplinary approach to this and puts a real focus on looking, it is just such a great effort. And it's something that I think will receive a lot of public interest in as well, because we're all curious. Yeah. We're all curious.
I think the most recent hypothesis of where life could have originated on Earth is in hyperthermal vents underwater, but also these vents have a prominent concentration of sulfur in them. And actually it was thought that there's been microbes that have been found that actually metabolize using sulfur, whereas other organisms would metabolize using carbon and oxygen in their place. So it's hypothesized that these could have been some of the earliest organisms. So it'll be interesting to know or find out in the future whether one of the signatures they're looking for is these sulfur-containing compounds as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because Sascha was saying that some of the signatures that you look for as evidence of life can be created by other things as well. So it makes it difficult because you've got this interference effectively that is making it harder to see. Even if you found, for example, I don't know, oxygen or CO2 in an atmosphere, doesn't necessarily mean that it was created by life.
I always think in terms of, obviously in the news recently, there's been a lot on virology and what is it that actually makes something life? If we're looking for life, what constitutes as life? Is it that it can self-replicate? Is it that it can metabolize? So it'll be interesting to know sort of what the parameters are that they're using for life.
It is interesting because especially when you look at things like flora, even like plants, like hypothesizing here, imagine if you say had a planet that has these kind of like plants or algae or whatever it is, or very, very small microorganisms. It's, do we still class that in life in the sense of, is it important? Do we value it the same that we value our own planet and our own organisms? Like how do we, I suppose, quantify the information and think about it with respect to kind of our planet? I think one thing that I think we should kind of keep in mind or think about moving forward is that we kind of have to broaden our views on, I suppose, what we're expecting to see, and maybe almost lower our expectations of it. The green man might not actually be a green man. He may be a very small microorganism.
I was going to say, obviously one of the key sort of things in the definition of life that we're using at the moment is that transfer of information and genetic information. So I'd be interested to know whether one of the signatures they're looking for are any nucleic acids or potentially amino acids, or whether they're open to the idea of a whole different system for the transfer of information based on a completely different world that we're unaware of in terms of chemical composition.
I think also what you've got to remember is that we're still building the technologies that we need to even look at atmospheric composition. Like the James Webb Telescope is amazing, but now we also need this other extremely large telescope. We need space missions. In terms of, there might be a gap between what we understand as life and what life could be, and maybe what we don't understand, but also what we can physically look at and record, given where we are at the moment. So it might just be that the steps we take at the moment and in the next 25 years bring us to a certain point, and then within that time we create new technologies or means of looking for life in of different categories. I don't know how best to phrase it, but yeah, I think as much as it's a question of what life is, which I guess is the second part or the other part of their project as well, like as much that this looking at extrasolar planets is one part of the center, but the other part of the center is looking at focusing on life on Earth and how we think about it and how it arose and why it arose and all of these questions that you guys are very rightly so bringing up. So it'll be interesting to see what comes from not just Sascha's research, but also the other half of the center as well.
The feeling I have, there's so much enthusiasm about this topic, not only here, but literally throughout the world. And not only from astrophysicists or biologists and chemists, from so many people. I think it's not impossible. We just have to do it right. We have to be nice to each other, collaborate with each other, make everyone understand that this question is bigger than any one of us, for sure. So, let's put aside our ego. And I think then we can pull it off. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. But it's, in the end of the day, I really think we can make this work.
I think it was mentioned before when we were talking about the bioprinting study as well, about funding. And as part of the interview, we did talk a little bit more about why people should care and why people should invest. And it's almost what we were talking about lowering our expectations or what we're looking for there. I think it's interesting to think that if we went through all of this and we found an example of a microbe on a different planet, what would it mean? And obviously it won't necessarily reflect much about our world necessarily, maybe, or we're not going to be looking for a backup planet, for example. But it's cool to think of it as just, science in pursuit of science, like knowledge, not necessarily with any kind of commercial focus or trying to save our planet or any sort of thing driving us, like this, no sort of urgency. It's just this idea, it's almost like old-fashioned science, you're just doing it just because you want to know.
The pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, the pursuit of knowledge.
Science for the sake of science.
Yeah, and it's one of the oldest questions out there, isn't it? Is there life beyond Earth? And it's cool. Obviously, and Sascha said it himself, it's difficult because this kind of research requires so much funding, and it's a decent question to ask. Can this money be spent elsewhere? Do we, with everything going on in the world right now, do we need to be spending millions and billions of pounds or dollars on a massive space mission to look for these life signatures? And it's a valid question, but I mean, maybe it's privileged of me to say it, but I think I like the idea of, we waste so much money on things all the time anyway. I mean, the distribution of wealth, I'm not going to go into the distribution of wealth, but I'm just saying that maybe it's cool that something like this is just simply after an answer to a question. Yeah. And it doesn't have to have any greater meaning beyond the fact that we did it.
I believe, and I feel like it all boils down to one of the most natural things that I suppose we have as higher cognitive beings is curiosity. And I think one thing I suppose to kind of add to that is, if we don't try, will we ever know? And will we be okay with not ever knowing? I think that's something that we'll continue to battle with. And all the points you've raised are very valid and very much apply to that. And, you know, curiosity is a very pure thing. And I think it's nice that it drives things as well.
This is so deep.
I know.
I like it though. I think this is why it was my favorite interview, because on one side of things it was like, wow, cool, just aliens and space and rockets and all this kind of stuff. But on the other side, it was actually kind of profound, you know, why they're doing it. And
did you leave the interview a little bit like spaced out? Like, what
I was
is
giddy.
life?
Pun intended.
Why am I here?
I like floated out of that interview room. I think I said to you, I was like, oh, it went so well. I loved it.
So I'm sure many of our listeners and even some of my podcast co-hosts here will have experienced some form of physical therapy following injury. And although we might not have done it for as long as we should have, the benefits of physical therapy are undoubted. After all, muscle and joint rehabilitation can have the power to restore movement that was once lost, even if it's something as simple as being able to flex your fingers or being able to run again. Still, for many across the globe, physical rehabilitation remains out of reach as a lack of available and accessible physical therapists puts pressure on the ever-growing waiting lists of healthcare systems. Now I'm going to talk a bit about a piece of content recently published on our AzoNetwork site, talking about a group of researchers based at MIT that have developed a motion monitoring system called Muscle Rehab that uses sensors for autonomous physical rehabilitation. The Muscle Rehab system comprises three main features. It has an electrical impedance tomography, a bodysuit with body motion sensors, and I highly encourage everyone to go check it out just so you can see what this bodysuit looks like. And when I say bodysuit, I mean full-on bodysuit. And also a virtual reality headset. So one benefit of this system that I think is pretty cool is that the sensor-based monitoring gives the patient a level of autonomy without actually compromising the accuracy of the data required for recovery. So often when you have unsupervised or autonomous systems, especially for physical rehabilitation, it relies on the individual who's undergoing the treatment or undergoing the therapy to actually kind of give the feedback and give the updates, which can kind of offer a subjective opinion of actually what is going. So it's not necessarily the most accurate, which is, you know, no fault on the person itself, but can actually hinder the therapy and the results of their therapy and how well the rehabilitation is going to go. So the team hopes that the muscle rehab could actually facilitate more accurate, quote-unquote, at-home rehabilitation, which would significantly impact physical therapy as it relieves the pressure on the very long and in-demand waiting list for PTs and improves patient accessibility. I kind of like this story because I think it touches a little bit more on the broader topic of at-home and point-of-testing treatment and how that might change in the future as people kind of start to take a little bit more, I suppose, authority and autonomy on their healthcare, and even kind of thinking about accessibility and what it would mean for individuals that can't easily get to healthcare institutions or healthcare institutions aren't accessible.
I agree.
Is this the green suit that
The
Beth
one,
and
yeah,
Beth
yeah.
showed
So
us.
just to kind of illustrate the image, the suit itself, I believe, is kind of all in black with these little, I suppose, dots on. Like if anyone's seen Andy Serkis and like what he wears to act as Gollum, it's something very, very similar to that. And at the moment, the suit itself monitors therapy for, I believe it's one of the muscles in our thighs. So that's kind of where the focus is at the moment, but they're hoping to move to the groin area as well, and obviously other areas of the body. But again, I highly encourage you to check out the image. It is quite interesting, and I do enjoy the thought of people wearing it in their own homes.
I have to say, I had to do physiotherapy. I compressed two of my vertebrae a while back, and I was so bad at doing my physiotherapy. I literally still have issues now because I didn't do it.
Mine's exactly the same. Yep.
But still, like, I went to see like a physio recently, and they were like, you should do this. And I was like, yeah, I will. And you thinking about it now, I was like, oh God, I never did a single exercise. But I have to say, I don't know if I had to put on a morph suit every single time I did it. I'm not sure that would encourage me to do it more frequently. But I think I'm just really lazy.
No, true. But I suppose, you know, we're very lucky living in the UK that we have, you know, the NHS and we have that. But a lot of countries don't have a public funded healthcare system.
Yeah.
And I think, especially because of the long waiting lists and the inaccessibility to healthcare, you know, lots of money, morph suit.
Yeah, to be fair, if I'd paid like $5,000 to get the physio, I think I would probably do it.
Suck up and wear the morph suit.
Yeah.
And sometimes maybe people who struggle to sort of like read instructions or understand how written instructions translate to an actual physical movement, something like this would be really helpful for them. They might actually need to see it. And obviously, once you're out of that consultation, you're not going to see a person actually physically do that movement again, unless maybe you have access to a recorded video. So this might give support to those people who struggle in that respect.
No, definitely. And I think it definitely kind of ties into how medical devices and, kind of monitoring systems in healthcare are changing to kind of more reflect, or at least I like to think they're changing to more reflect the needs of the individual and of the person actually undergoing the treatment. And anything that we can kind of do to help improve that and help improve that experience, personally, I think is quite a vital component of medical devices as we do continue to transition to a more technology-focused society.
Yeah, it's not just about obviously it's equally as important, but it's not just about making it easier for the healthcare provider, it's about making it easier for the person who's receiving that treatment.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%.
We're going back to high school level history, actually, rather than science. Fun little fact, I did a course called Medicine Through Time, and we learn a lot about medical science through the ages. And it's a personal interest that stayed with me post-study, which I don't think you can say for the majority of high school education, but it actually has stayed with me and I'm very interested in it. So when I saw that gout is actually a 21st century epidemic and not just a disease of kings as it was previously known, I thought I would bring it to the table. So Gout, Disease of Kings and Now a 21st Century Epidemic is the title of an article published recently on News Medical. And shockingly enough, around 3 million Americans have gout, a disease previously thought to be restricted to the excess and indulgence of kings of the past. So strong is the link between gout and the rich that gout actually used to be a status symbol. So people would boast about having it because it showed that they had enough money to buy sort of like game and other animal proteins such as pork, which I thought was quite astounding. For those who don't know, gout is actually an arthritic condition that occurs when a high concentration of uric acid is present in the blood, and then uric acid crystals actually accumulate in the joints, causing inflammation and pain. Then a higher than normal concentration of uric acid can be due to too much uric acid being synthesized, but equally it can also be caused when the kidneys are compromised and cannot work to remove that uric acid. And there is some link between the game-loving nobles of Tudor times, as a diet rich in animal proteins such as pork is linked to gout, and other lifestyle factors such as alcohol can also exacerbate this condition. Now, you may be asking, how is gout a 21st century epidemic? We're not in the Tudor times anymore. No one's eating a hog roast every night.
No one's going out getting their deer for dinner.
Yeah, no one's having a hog roast every night. But in recent years, the US has seen a significant rise in cases due to obesity levels, but also the use of diuretics that are used to treat high blood pressure. So lifestyle changes can ultimately help in the treatment of gout, but equally so can anti-inflammatory medications. And I just thought this was a nice example of history and medical science coming together for a neat little story of how seemingly eradicated, that's in little quotation marks, diseases can actually reoccur.
One of the things that Danielle has spoken about is how it was actually a status symbol. I believe, was it teeth as well? If you had bad teeth, that was another status symbol.
It showed that you could eat sweet things. And
yeah, to the point of where all kind of the richer people in all the times had really bad teeth, and all the so-called quote-unquote peasants had good teeth, or had better teeth at least.
Yeah, and I think they would even do things to make the teeth look worse.
Yeah, they would. Oh, it does kind of, it makes me laugh what people used to think were the things to do or the things to be, like postmodern medicine. It just kind of blow my mind. But I feel like with gout, it's definitely one of those things, because it's like you say, it does affect so many people. And I think it's perhaps one of those conditions that has got a little bit of, a stigma attached to it.
Yeah, definitely.
In the sense of, whereas, maybe people don't want to admit they've got it, or maybe they don't want to go and even kind of go in for treatment, because, when you think of gout, a lot of the time, you think of, if you had UK education, Henry VIII, very large individual, and I feel like there should definitely be more awareness and more effort to, show how important it is to get tested or to get treated and getting treatment is fine, and there are many, many people that are affected by it. It's like you say, it is a 21st century epidemic.
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight as well that whilst those lifestyle elements that I mentioned, such as diet and alcohol consumption, can exacerbate gout, but actually there is a genetic link. And like I mentioned as well, if the kidneys aren't working properly, they can also lead to gout. So it's not always something that I think maybe that's where the stigma comes from, that you've brought it on yourself, that your diet isn't good enough, but actually it can be genetic, or it can be something involved in the kidneys, and obviously that's no fault of anyone, and that there should be no stigma attached to that.
No, definitely. And fun fact, this may also need fact checking, but I believe figs also can worsen the condition. If you have gout, can also kind of worsen the symptoms of it. So
Figs.
This is going back to a previous conversation we had today, but in figs,
yes, the wasps.
It's wasps.
Yeah. I know you're going to say that's why I don't eat figs.
No,
it freaks me out. I've tried it. Nope.
No, it's a bit weird.
You know what? I'm going to fact check this in real time.
Real-time fact check.
So for our listeners, like a lot of fruit species, you're going to have a male and a female. You have male and female species of plants, and you also have that for figs. And to kind of help pollinate the species, you often have insects such as bees and wasps to help pollinate the female, because they go through sexual reproduction rather than asexual reproduction. So what happens is that the female wasp crawls inside through a hole so narrow that she loses her wings in the process and becomes trapped. So you have your little fig, and then usually it's like the end of the fig, the wasp will crawl inside. So if the fig is a male, the female wasp will lay her eggs inside, and then the eggs will kind of hatch and burrow out, right? Which will turn into little baby wasps and fly off.
And they will,
and they will carry the fig pollen with them to kind of continue the pollination process. But if the wasp climbs into a female fig, she will pollinate it, but can't lay her eggs inside, so she dies. And then what happens, this is evolution at work, people. The female fig produces an enzyme that digests the wasp completely. So the crunchy bits are seeds, not wasp hearts, in case you're wondering. But yes, there is a dead wasp contributing to the growth of the fig.
Okay, well, that's the wrap for this episode. Thank you for listening to Something About Science, and don't forget to check out the content discussed, as all links are in the description. And that's all from me, Skylar, and also Megan and Danielle, and we'll see you next time.
If you enjoyed listening, please think about leaving a review on your podcast provider, sharing this episode on social media, or with friends, family, and colleagues you think might enjoy it as well.
This episode was brought to you by AzoNetwork.
We'll be back soon with more discussions about science.